Welcome, everybody. Let me just explain how we're going to proceed so that everybody knows how we're choreographing the event. So after I introduce both Timmons Roberts, our speaker, and Alex Thompson, who's going to provide comments after Timmons speaks, then we will open it for discussion. So at that point, both of them will come up to the table so they can be available for conversing with you, okay? What I decided to do was to go ahead and introduce both of them before we start the event instead of disrupting after Timmons finishes talking to introduce Alex. So I will begin with J. Timmons Roberts. He is Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also a member of the Board on Environmental Change and Society of the National Academy of Sciences. Sorry, I can't seem to speak correctly today. Timmons is part of an international effort to produce a quantum leap in transparency in climate finance and foreign aid more broadly. His Climate and Development Lab at Brown University provides research support to the Least Developed Countries Group, the world's 49 poorest nations, for the United Nations negotiations. He also is a leader in Rhode Island's efforts to plan for how to adapt to climate changes, serving on the Rhode Island Climate Change Commission, which was created in 2010 by legislation written by Timmons and his Brown students. Prior to his current position at Brown, he held positions at the College of William and Mary and at Tulane University, and in 2006 and 2007 he was a visiting professor at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. Currently, Timmons is working on 3 books, which include Latin America and the Next Decade of Climate Politics, co-authored with Guy Edwards, which will be published by MIT Press, and Power in a Warming World, which is co-authored with David Siplett and Meeson Khan, also to be published by MIT Press. A recent book is titled A Climate of Injustice, Global Inequality, North-South Politics, and Climate Policy, which was co-authored with Bradley Parks and again was published by MIT Press. They must really like you.
They're very good on environmental politics.
Environmental politics, okay. So as you know, today he will speak on climate justice, Latin America, and the UN negotiations. Our commentator is Alex Thompson in the maroon sweater, sitting in front with his back to you. Wave. Okay. He's an associate professor of political science. An associate professor of political science and a faculty associate of the Mershon Center, right here. His research and teaching interests are in the area of international relations, with a particular emphasis on the politics of international organizations and law. Among others, his research addresses the question of why states create and how they design institutions at the international level. Some of his projects focus on the evolution of the global climate regime, the negotiation and ratification of international investment agreements, and the politics of multilateral weapons inspections and the enforcement of international law. His book, Channels of Power, the UN Security Council and U.S. Statecraft in Iraq, published by Cornell University Press, explores why the United States sometimes channels its foreign policies through international organizations and other times acts alone. His articles have appeared in various journals, including International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, the Journal of Legal Studies, Climatic Change, International Theory, and Policy Studies Journal. So please join me in welcoming both our speaker and our commentator, and then I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'm looking forward to Alex's comments, and I really appreciate all of you coming, and I appreciate Alex's time looking at earlier materials that were sent to him and bothering with showing up on a Friday afternoon, or whatever today is. Friday afternoon. Thank you all for coming. and we even, had to keep the schools out of session to get more people here to eat the good food and hopefully have some worthwhile discussion about what I think is a really important topic. And I want to also acknowledge my mother, who is, for the first time yesterday and today, at any of my talks. She's Ohio State University class of 1953. So that's her 61st reunion year. So anyway, really, really impressive. And here's my Uncle Dave, who's the class of 1951, so his 63rd reunion year. I just had my 30th reunion, so I know what that's getting to be like. So today I'm going to talk about this book that Guy Edwards and I are writing, and Guy really is my co-conspirator, co-author on this. I want to acknowledge his work. He's a fellow in my Center for Environmental Studies, and he's kind of a co-leader of my lab group. So the lab model I use is really undergraduate and graduate students, and then a couple of fellows working together on research projects that hopefully have some policy relevance, and we really try to feed materials into the UN process as much as we can, working with some NGOs, sort of think tanks in the US and Europe. So here's my topics. I'll just give you my outline to start off. I'm going to first talk about the basics of climate change and its impacts globally and in Latin America. That's going to be pretty brief. And then I'll talk about whether Latin America is really a model of low carbon development that is emitting very little greenhouse gases. There are some, Guy and I both argue that really the region has some of the best countries in the world, some best models. There's also some problematic cases and a lot of things to worry about. We'll describe our research goals in our book and in this presentation, and then dive sort of deeply into what's going on in the negotiations by looking at some of the big players in Latin America, especially Brazil and this negotiating group called BASIC, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, which formed up for the Copenhagen round in 2009. ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for Our Americas, which is led by Bolivia and Venezuela and Nicaragua, and some other countries are in there, providing a different perspective and oftentimes being quite radically in support of the rights of Mother Earth. I touched something, and hopefully that'll go away. Will that go away? Go away. And then Mexico and this new group called ILAC, the Alianza Independiente de Latinoamérica and Caribe, which is about 7 or 8 countries that are sort of more progressive in terms of what they're willing to do on climate change, and I think are really an inspiration and a hopeful development in the last, literally this formed about a year ago. So then talk about climate policy issues for Latin America. So here we go. Part 2, the basics of climate impacts. So, for years we've understood that the climate change is driven by a buildup of this layer. If we didn't have any greenhouse layer, we would be in trouble, that it would be too cold on Earth, but there's been sort of a very nice level of greenhouse gases of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides, other N gases as they're called. There's a sort of a number of greenhouse gases. I want to keep this really simple. But with our burning of gigatons of fossil fuels per year, bringing the stuff up out of the ground, we're building up this thicker layer of greenhouse gases. So the sunlight comes in, and then the heat is radiated off the planet. And if there's more greenhouse gases, then less of it escapes back into space, and more of it reflects back to Earth and keeps it warm. So just that's the greenhouse effect, is you can sort of think about, in a greenhouse you close the windows and the sun comes in and it warms up the room. And if you open the windows, the heat escapes, but the more you close the windows, or if you leave your car in a parking lot with the sun on it, it's going to be a lot hotter if you have the windows rolled up all the way. So we're rolling up the windows of the Earth's car. And the pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases were roughly 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalents. Carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas. And now we just passed 400 parts per million There's a big activist group, 350.org, so their point is that we need to stay below 350, so we're already past what they say is safe. Most of the sort of science simplified, dumbed down for policymakers says 450 is the point at which we're going to head into dangerous climate change. So we need to stay below 450 parts per million, which is going to be very, very hard. We have a very tough job to stay below that. So just this fall, and then again this spring, there's going to be released the newest parts of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report. And there's different working groups. There are thousands of scientists who participate in this process, and then governments approve the summary documents. So this was the first piece that came out, Working Group 1, in this last fall. It shows above annual average temperatures of the planet rising since 1850. And people are saying, well, wait a minute, climate change has sort of stopped. We're at this plateau, right? It's leveled off. Well, it does seem to have leveled off, at least for the present time, but it's leveled off at the highest levels ever. So, the seasons are changing in spite of this winter being a cold one. The fall is going later in the fall, the spring is coming earlier, things are blooming at different times. But the biggest impacts that we're worried about is, and anyway, it suggests that the climate system might be going in stepwise as a lot of heat gets absorbed by the ocean and a lot of carbon dioxide and so on. There are parts of the system we just don't understand. So the whole idea that we might be able to manage this as sort of a global scientific experiment is highly questionable. I would say that we don't know really how the system works. Nobody expected this sort of leveling off and moving up in steps. This is just historical data recorded over the last 113 years at what's happening to global temperatures, and you can see where it's been warming up. And in some places it's already up a degree or two, and this is in Celsius, what I've been describing. So small temperature differences can make a big difference, especially because those are averages. In Latin America, there are these series of impacts that are already being noticed, and some that are expected to get worse. So one is the collapse of the Caribbean coral reefs. Coral reefs are really susceptible to acidification of the ocean as carbon dioxide is absorbed by H2O. It creates carbonic acid and often can destroy coral reefs, which require just the right pH in order to create that calcification, the buildup of the coral plants, coral organisms. Another is an intensification of weather patterns and storms. So, in the U.S. we've experienced Katrina and Sandy and a lot of other hurricanes, but in the Caribbean is extremely vulnerable to hurricanes, gets whacked every year, and as the storms are getting more intense, they're not necessarily increasing in number, but they're increasing in intensity. I mean, they're built by hot water and hot air, which hold more energy in them. It's pretty simple. They're more and more at risk of these in more intense storms. Increased flooding and droughts. So there's already been observed drops in precipitation in key areas of Latin America. That's, for one thing, needing that rainfall for rain-fed agriculture. There's much less irrigation in the region than there is, for example, in much of the United States. And then there's also the need for all this water for hydroelectricity. Right? A lot of the countries have built up, especially since the 1970s oil crisis, built up their hydroelectric systems. And that's part of what makes them very low carbon economies, is because of hydroelectric facilities. So it's really problematic that we're not going to have as much electricity coming if these droughts continue. And it's also, a risk of course, sending migrants away from regions, agricultural regions, where they're highly dependent on rainfall for agriculture, small-scale agriculture especially. There's the glacial melt, so I wanted to give my shout-out to where's my glacier geologists? Yeah, so This is a really big deal. This is the water supply for big urban areas and also agriculture in the Andes, where the glaciers are disappearing very quickly in a matter of decades. It's going to be a big problem. And there's spread also of tropical diseases as malaria, yellow fever, things like that are spreading from their traditional areas to new parts of the continent, and of course they're often to the United States. And then there's this, one of the big tipping points that people are worried about is the Amazon ecosystem, and whether these big droughts are going to drive that system into a new equilibrium or out of its fairly steady state right now. So there's a lot of things to worry about. Some Latin American leaders are becoming vocal about the threat of climate change. So here's the former Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom, and I'll let you read the quote. And what he's referring to here is that Guatemala is not formally listed as one of the most vulnerable countries by the United Nations process. Starting in Bali, there was listed 3 regions of the world that are considered highly vulnerable by definition. That's Africa, the least developed countries, those 48 countries that my lab group works with, and the small island developing states. So Guatemala and some other Latin American countries are not in those categories. Really, we have Haiti and some of the small islands of the Caribbean are included, but there's a lot of countries that are not. So Latin American countries are saying, wait a minute, we need to be considered also. So they created a new negotiating group called the Highly Vulnerable Countries. So Latin American citizens have for decades now shown high levels of concern about environmental problems, higher than the United States, and in the case of climate change as well. So there's been a bunch of surveys, and they show that this poll by Nielsen, for example, internet users, in 51 countries concluded that Latin American concern was expressed by 90% of those consulted. By the global average was only 69%. The Latin American Caribbean citizens have demonstrated repeatedly they're highly concerned and have been far less skeptical than North American neighbors. And press coverage in the region has increased a lot, especially as they're being battered by climate impacts such as floods in Colombia, major drought in Mexico, tropical depression in Central America, all of which have cost billions of dollars in damages. So the press was for a long time sort of considering this as an issue for the rest of the world and not so much for the region, and now there's been sort of a shift to the coverage to considering it as much a Latin American issue. This is a slide I used yesterday as well from an Ecuadorian group, Amigos de la Tierra and Acción Ecológica, saying that there's really a debt to be paid. That is, there's the northern parts of the world are using a lot of electricity, and the southern parts of the world are using much less. So they're making the point that there's a climate debt that some groups have gone to the UN negotiations and demanded the payment of. And then others, this has been taken up by Oxfam and Friends of the Earth and so on, international. And they also, so this is sort of part of an increasing discourse of climate justice, that this is an issue of the people who are most responsible for the problem are often doing the least, and the people who are the least responsible are the ones who are suffering the most. To sum up climate justice in a sentence. So our research goals in this book, which we're trying desperately to finish right now, so any input is really welcome, is to better understand whether Latin American countries can be considered leaders. Sorry, I have trouble with my numbering apparently. As I went from Mac to, actually I was going to do this in Google Docs, and then to Mac, and then to PC. So we're trying to understand whether Latin American countries can be considered leaders on climate change at the negotiations. We contend that they really can be. Point number one, again, to better understand the linkages between domestic and international policy. So what's going on at home, how does that influence how these countries show up at the UN negotiations and how they behave, and vice versa. And then to analyze the relationship with these 3 main global trading partners, the EU, the US, and China, and how that affects their climate policy and climate politics. So, sorry, these are a lot of points, but just a roundup of how good or bad Latin America is on emissions. So Latin America is only about 12% of the global total of emissions, so it's the second lowest out of Africa. On a per capita basis, it contributes more than China and India. Brazil is the major part of the emissions from the region, over 52% in a recent year. This was in 2005. And then Mexico, Venezuela, and Argentina. And if you look overall in the region, it's been largely from deforestation, or land use change, and forestry, or LULUCF, as they call it, UN speak, as well as agriculture. So the region's emissions are about half from deforestation, about 20% from agriculture. That, however, has been dropping as their deforestation is getting more under control in the Amazon, especially in Brazil, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then there's a lot of economic growth. A lot of Latin America, some would say, sailed through the economic crisis that so affected us in the north, in the U.S. And part of that was by selling off increasing amounts of raw materials to China for its economic growth. So that's a big issue that we're quite concerned about, and that we're focusing on trying to understand whether that's, it's increasing its fossil fuel consumption and therefore its emissions, and so it's changing the sort of regional profile on how greenhouse gas emissions work. But then it's also we're trying to understand if that's changing the way it behaves in the negotiations. And it looks like there's projections that the emissions will grow by 10% over this 10-year period, and then 33% as the region continues to grow economically. So if, as the IPCC says, we have to reduce our emissions by a lot, this is worrisome. Okay, so this is from a paper with Julia Steinberger, who's at University of Leeds now. She was at the Institute for Social Ecology in Vienna. And Glenn Peters, who's in Oslo at Cicero, that got cut off. So we're trying to understand pathways of economic development and how it relates to trade. So I drew this on the board for the few people who were there yesterday, but basic idea is that we have tons of emissions of carbon dioxide per capita across the bottom. So if we could all stay under 1 ton, it would be a good world, right? This is what we call Goldenberg's Corner, after José Goldenberg, who was the environment minister in Brazil, who had a nice article about this is where we all want to be. We want to have high life expectancy in years. So here we have 55, 60, 65 years, 70, 75, 80, 85 years of life. So in the US, our average life expectancy in 1990, sorry, that was weird, about 73 years life expectancy, and we're emitting about 5.3 tons of carbon. So you see that? Am I making sense? So we have a pretty high carbon model of development in the US. Some of the best in the world here, over here, Costa Rica and Chile. And here's China. So here we go. You ready? This is in 1990, and then we're going to go every year through 2005 was as far as we got with this, when we published this. So you can see what happened over that time. Costa Rica went from a higher life expectancy than the US to an even higher life expectancy without really increasing its emissions per capita in tons of carbon. So they've stayed in the good, the Goldenberg's corner. Chile is sort of, wavering, but has, gotten back into the good zone and has made big improvements in its life expectancy. Here's India, has made a lot of improvements, and it's not clear what direction it's going to go. So overall, there's this curve, right, of the countries. This was in 1990, and this is in 2005. There's the same curve, but it's higher up. And Brazil actually has made huge improvements and has moved into this corner and has not actually made this sort of right turn towards higher carbon emissions, at least to this period. China, though, is making this worrisome right turn, as you might predict if you think that that curved line is sort of set in stone. So you with me on this? So now, but wait a minute. This is emissions of a country overall. What about the countries that trade a lot of their products overseas? So like in China, China is sort of our workshop of the world. Why should they have to get counted against them all the emissions for the products like our computers and so on that we're consuming? In other words, we sort of offshored a lot of our own emissions. So this is another analysis showing that, you know, if we include carbon dioxide corrected for trade, the U.S. is actually worse than it looked like based on how much we actually emit in our country. China or Japan's a lot worse. Chile is a little better than it should be. Costa Rica is somewhat worse. China's actually better than it looked. So, and Brazil's about the same. So here's the same analysis showing that, you know, some of China's movement to the right is actually because of exporting so many products that are high in carbon. The U.S. we're doing worse than it looked. Costa Rica is doing a little worse than it looked. Chile is about the same. Brazil's about the same, maybe a little better than it looked. So you get the idea here? There's a lot in here. It's quite interesting, but it does still show that, you know, if we're looking for models around the world of low carbon development, there's really almost none better than Costa Rica, Chile, Brazil. Latin America is a resources superpower. This is sort of another reason, you know, set of reasons to care about the region. It's got a lot of our arable lands, our forests, the oil reserves, all these mineral reserves. There's a lot of its history. It contains huge biodiversity, and it's estimated to have a third of the world's freshwater resources. But what we're concerned about, again, is this sort of shift back to the future, as we say, you know, back to what's been a colonial legacy of the region, having been settled largely for the extraction of its gold, silver, copper, and then later for its, you know, spices and sugar and coffee and bananas and all these sort of raw materials that were in effect sort of mining the soil and having perverse effects on its ecology and its human and political systems. So, you know, there was efforts to move away from raw materials exports in the region because they received such low value in global trade in general. So, you know, they fell from 52% of exports in the early 80s to a low of about 27% in the late 90s, but it started to rise again and it's back up to almost 40%. And this is minerals, hydrocarbons, especially natural gas and oil, agriculture and livestock, forestry and fishery products. You know, it depends on the country that you're talking about, but there's a lot of new raw materials getting exported from Latin America. Its principal partners are major investors in the region, and most recently China is investing like crazy in Latin America. Its goods growth has grown faster than with any other region of the world, and Latin America's exports to China are concentrated in its raw materials, which are over 60% of the total exports. So things are changing. China Development Bank and other institutions have spent $75 billion on financial investments in South America, more than the World Bank, the U.S. Export Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank put together. So what China is doing is very much like what the U.S. and Japan did in former decades, but it's happening very quickly now, and especially at a time when we're worried about climate change, so we're worried about what the impact of that is. So that's just kind of repeating a lot of those points. Let's see if there's anything new I need to say. Again, it's also a mix of private investment from China and also government loans and leadership. So on to you know, how this might impact the UN negotiations. There's you know, one of the concerns is that China is a big leader in the group of 77, the G77 negotiating bloc, and we're wondering if some countries are shifting their positions to not offend China, which has been resistant to taking very aggressive targets on the climate change, you know, emissions limits. So there's a lot of history here. checking my time here. I don't want to go into too much. My goal is to finish early, so we'll have lots of time for discussion. But the original UN Framework Convention was signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 at the Earth Summit. The largest number of heads of states in the world in history were there. Turned into a binding treaty in Kyoto in 1997. It had a first commitment period, which went into effect in 2005, which ran out in 2012. And it was supposed to be negotiated in 2009, the new Kyoto version 2.0. However, the Copenhagen ended up sort of going off the rails, and we ended up with Brazil, South Africa, India, and China getting together with the United States and writing their own Copenhagen Accord, which took the pressure off of the big emitters by making it into a sort of voluntary system. So what's gone on since then is, the next year was in Cancun, where Mexico was the host, and I'll talk more about that year because it was quite important in sort of saving the talks. The big deadline right now is in Paris in 2015, where they're supposed to come up with a new treaty which will go into effect in 2020. So really it's been sort of kicked down the road in the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, and negotiated a couple years ago, that we won't really have any treaty in effect until 2020, which in terms of staying under that number I described at the beginning of the talk, 450 parts per million, is really worrisome. It's too long. Latin America does not speak with one voice at the negotiations. In fact, there's a lot of voices now. It used to be they all negotiated with the G77, and then it started to fragment in very interesting ways. So there's the Association of Small Island States, which are really worried about sea level rise. The oceans are rising. It's measured as both Greenland is melting and also warm water expands over cooler water. So they're seeing already the impacts, right, of sea level rise and this intensification of storms. So a lot of the Caribbean countries are in that group. There's a Central American integration group which sometimes negotiates together of the countries here. ALBA, I mentioned, the Bolivarian Alliance, is more radical and is focused in the negotiations often on the process and on sort of avoiding the domination of a few large wealthy countries. And it's also focused on this rights of Mother Earth. There's the basic group I described, where Brazil is with India, South Africa, and China. The Environmental Integrity Group is a very unusual group and pretty small, that Mexico has participated in for years, which has some wealthy countries and some small ones. Actually, I think Switzerland is in that as well. OPEC, the oil producers are important in the negotiations, so we have Ecuador and Venezuela are members of the oil producing and exporting countries. There's this group of highly vulnerable countries I mentioned, including Guatemala, Colombia, El Salvador, Peru, and Chile. There's a coalition of rainforest nations. There's the Cartagena Dialogue, which has been led by Colombia and other countries, which includes wealthy and poor countries in a sort of informal discussion group. And then, of course, there's the old G77 in China. So countries are able to sort of choose which group they want to make a statement with during the negotiations, depending on what point of their national interest they want to represent. So now we're into the part of the talk where I'm going to talk about these three real important groups. Brazil. Brazil was really one of the leaders in the negotiation from the beginning, but it sort of wants to be a regional leader, but there's been other countries sort of, they are not willing to sort of fall in line behind Brazil as they, Brazil is trying to also gain a place on the Security Council in the UN. I mentioned Brazil's important role at Copenhagen. Also at Copenhagen, Lula, at that time President Lula, put forward a climate change plan, which you can read here on the screen, with some very strong targets of emissions reductions. And these were actually, he put them up in Copenhagen, and they had to scramble around and actually get them passed in Congress when he got home, but they did. And included in that was reducing Amazon deforestation by 80%, and they were really on their way to doing so. And quite a huge drop, 76% drop in cumulative emissions between 2005 and 2010. But it's back up again in the last year. And then there's this huge Prezal offshore oil reserve. So it looks like Brazil's emissions are going to come swinging back up, but it's not clear exactly where it's going. President Dilma is much more focused on economic growth and has done things like create incentives for people to buy, like tax holidays, tax reductions so people can buy automobiles. And she's also reduced this sort of subsidy on the price of ethanol, which has made Brazil also a very low carbon economy because it has, the cars are all flex fuel now. So drivers will, if the price of gas is close to the price of ethanol, just buy gasoline because it holds more energy. So the price of ethanol has to be at least 30% below the gas price for people to even buy the ethanol. So now more people are switching over to gasoline, which is driving up its fossil fuel emissions. So Brazil seeks to be a leader, but also has this things going on nationally. There's this Bolivarian alliance, which has rebelled against the procedures and the weak agreement in the final sessions in Copenhagen and Cancun, especially Claudia Salerno from Venezuela was famously banging her fist on the table and they're holding up her hand bloodied from, they have these little name plates that they turn up when they want to speak in the big plenary sessions. And she, was banging hers on her table trying to get the attention of the chair, who was the Prime Minister of Denmark in Copenhagen, and bloodied her hand. It's like we have to bloody our hands to get the attention of the, we're being steamrolled here by the negotiations, so not following UN procedures. So very focused on the sort of the process side. There was also in Bolivia, there was the hosting of this World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba, which came up with a sort of declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, and that was trying to feed in a new set of principles into the negotiations. Some of those actually did come into the early drafts of negotiating texts, and then later on were all excluded. So they've all made it in, but didn't make it to final drafts, and so that's an interesting process. There's a new negotiating group called the Like-Minded Group, which includes all the countries, and then also some others that are trying to keep countries to an old principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, that the rich countries should act first, and the poorer countries should act only after the wealthy countries do. And in the case of Venezuela, there's quite a lot of skepticism about its motivations, as it often, under Chavez, used the negotiations as a way to beat up on the United States. Rightly or wrongly, certainly in the case of negotiations for climate change, the U.S. has not been a positive player, in my not so humble opinion. The whole world has really waited for the United States for 15 or 20 years now to do something on climate change, to make binding commitment and support the international process, and we've often been the source of the problem. So there's much to be criticized, but anyway, that some of the language coming out of Venezuela has been not very productive. And then Venezuela, of course, is hugely dependent on oil, so a lot of its positions seem to be at odds with its actual emissions. That's a lot of text. So after the mess in Copenhagen, Mexico took over as the chair for a year, the president of the Conference of the Parties, hosting in Cancun. And so they had a special ambassador, Luis Alfonso de Alba, who went all over the world and talked to people. Okay, I'm down to 5 minutes. I'm getting close. And they also had Patricia Espinosa, their foreign minister, who really were excellent at leading the negotiations, highly praised, as well as Cristiana Figueres from Costa Rica. So there was really some leadership from Latin America, especially Mexico, in sort of pulling the negotiations back on track. So what should I say about this? Mexico also has a strong climate change law, which was passed in 2012, including renewable portfolio standards, as they call them, that how much of the energy should come from solar, wind, and biofuels and so on. But the current Mexican president, Peña Nieto, is actually seems to be turning things back in the opposite direction, and there's a new privatization of oil law that just passed in the Congress, and it's allowing Mexico to really open up a lot of the Gulf of Mexico to offshore drilling by foreign investors. So there's going to be a new offshore boom off of Mexico. So this is a huge proven reserve, and there's going to be probably more found. 45 billion barrels of oil in excess of 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So that's a tricky business. Now the last bit, and this is sort of the group that Guy and I spent a lot of time talking about and trying to sort of get a little bit of chatter going about these people. So it's a new group, the Alianza Independiente de América Latina and Caribe, formed by Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Panama, and Peru. So it's committed to high ambition. They're not going to wait for the rich countries to act first. They want to just do something now. They see the need for countries taking bold steps in spite of their being not the rich countries. They would like to receive foreign assistance to help them do that, but they're not going to wait for it. So these are countries that are making the point that they can have a good life, they can have a good economy using the green technology, and that it's going to help them be positioned as the world leaders in the next round of economic growth, and not be sort of wedded to a whole set of infrastructure that's going to be sort of obsolete as the world finally realizes that it has to make stark reductions in our emissions of greenhouse gases. But some of those countries are struggling to balance the strong rhetoric with their actual local action at home. So in wrapping up, I have 2 more slides really. This is a big year because Peru is hosting the negotiations, and Peru is one of these ILAC countries. It has the opportunity to do again what Mexico did so well, going around the world, rounding up participation by countries, setting a bunch sort of international expectations, raising the bar. We have some positive signs that was mentioned yesterday, but also was discussed in the latest negotiations in Warsaw, Peru wanting to push for stronger ambition. However, there's some other stuff going on. Venezuela was originally supposed to host this year, but given some of the things going on with Chavez's illness, they decided not to do it, and Peru was chosen. It has to move to different regions of the world every year, so this was Latin America's year. There's big presidential elections that could go one way or the other in terms of the environment. For example, in Brazil, Marina Silva was the environment minister, very strong on climate change. And she was a presidential candidate last election. And really her candidacy has been sometimes given credit for why Lula made such a strong promise back in Copenhagen and then drove through the Congress those climate change goals. Because she put the pressure on. So she's going to be a candidate again this year. It's not clear how much traction her campaign will have, but it's likely to be a 2 or 3 way race, so she might have a chance. What else? There's some other things I could talk about here. Some of the important countries we talk about are Chile as a bridge, potentially between ILAC and ALBA, and Ecuador also going the other direction. Some of these countries that are able to speak to both groups are going to be quite important because it potentially could be polarizing. So here's the outline. I'm not going to repeat it where we've been, and I'll just sum up by saying Latin America actually has not been discussed more in the discussion of these negotiations. nor even on the problem of climate change. Some of the countries, however, have been a global model that doesn't get discussed very much. It's been an important leader on multilateralism, and increasingly so. We have this new axis of ambition, as people have called a couple of groups of countries pushing for more ambitious targets by developing countries, especially, by all countries. And however, this new resource boom led by China, we think threatens the ability of the region to stay on its low-carbon development pathway and to remain independent in the negotiations, as these countries need to be in order to make a strong case for ambitious action by developing countries. So we say that Latin America will be the region to watch in 2014, and as Lima in December, these negotiations are the last big step to get us to Paris and a new climate deal in 2015. So it's really Peru's chance to keep hope alive on this crucial global issue. There, how'd I do? Thanks a lot.
Okay.
40 minutes. Yeah.
Want to come over here?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Kathy, for the invitation. Thanks, Timmons, for the great talk and for coming to town. I've read your work over the years and really enjoyed it, so it's a pleasure to have you here. I think the talk was obviously really thought-provoking, and as someone who studies climate change and climate change negotiations, I can attest that it really does fill a gap. Latin American countries and sort of the region as a whole tends to get overlooked in a lot of discussions about climate policy and the UN-based negotiations, with the exception of Brazil and Mexico in some contexts. So this is really a breath of fresh air. Now, I'm not an expert on Latin America and the Caribbean, but I do work on climate change, so my comments will be sort of more general and coming from that angle rather than specifically the Latin America angle. My first, and a lot of these are more questions actually for Timmons or for the audience. They're not really, well anyway, it's a combination of questions and comments. First, I wanted to think about the future of the region's greenhouse gas emissions. So Latin America, as Timmons pointed out, stands out historically for its relatively low emissions, and it's true that Latin America's emissions per capita remain relatively low today. But despite the good news about things like deforestation, most signs point to a future of significantly higher emissions in the region. And Timmons touched on this, but I think the signs might be a little bit worse than the talk conveyed. The World Bank predicts that the region's emissions will increase by 33% by 2030, as Timmons noted. This would put the region well above the world average, if that is indeed the per capita level of emissions by 2030. And the reality is that several Latin American countries are large and fast-growing, which is good for a lot of reasons, but it puts a lot of emphasis on manufacturing and transportation, and of course creates a huge appetite for energy. On their own, these trends would imply higher greenhouse gas emissions in the future, but there are even more troubling signs of where this energy is going to come from. So Brazil has signed contracts for companies to exploit the Libra oil reserve under the Atlantic Ocean. Argentina is set to exploit shale gas reserves. Venezuela is exploiting its tar sands for oil. And Mexico is also turning attention to its deep water and shale reserves. So this is a real fossil fuel bonanza. And these unconventional methods of extracting fossil fuels will produce greater greenhouse gases when they're burned, but also in the sometimes energy-intensive process of extracting them. Not to mention, of course, the other environmental risks of doing things like drilling for oil under the ocean and hydraulic fracturing. So with this in mind, and I guess it's going to sound kind of like a cliche, but a question for Latin American countries is whether they or to what extent they're willing to embrace sort of sustainable development paradigm and pursue a path of growth that's consistent with human security today and that allows future generations to also enjoy economic development. I guess that's more of a comment, but my question for Timmons and maybe for others in the room is this: are there political forces in the region urging sustainable growth strategies? To put it even more bluntly, is there sufficient political willingness to forego some economic growth in the short run in order to contribute to sustainability and help mitigate climate change? Switching gears to the international level, I think one lesson from Timmons' talk is that the Latin America and Caribbean region is quite heterogeneous when it comes to the contribution of different countries to climate change and the impacts they'll feel. One way to think about it is that domestic political incentives and national interests are quite varied when it comes to climate policy in the region. And we saw this with the variety of negotiating blocs that Timmons pointed to. So on the one hand, we have some large and relatively fast-growing economies like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. On the other hand, we have some very small and some quite poor countries. Haiti's per capita income is just over $1,000 a year. So this raises the question of whether there are enough things that these countries have in common and that they can agree on to make it worthwhile to even think of them as a meaningful group in the context of global climate negotiations. This is an important question for analytical reasons, but also because the answer to the question could influence international negotiations. A coherent group with substantial solidarity could have could have much more bargaining power than a set of smaller, more fragmented blocs. It seems to me that one unifying concern across this region is adaptation. Whether it's the melting glaciers of the Andes, the concerns of coastal and island countries, the current and predicted impacts of climate change are significant in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this leads to a question: to what extent do we see convergence around adaptation policy and measures in the region? Do we see regional approaches or sharing of best practices across countries when it comes to adaptation? This might be a bellwether for whether the region's ability to cooperate and cohere around common positions more generally. Another way to think about this is that if the countries of Latin America can't sort of come together on the issue of adaptation, then they're probably not going to be able to come together on the wide variety of other issues in the international climate regime. Okay, this brings me to a final and sort of related set of questions which concern climate finance. So to give a little bit of background, and this will be even more familiar to Timmons than it is to me, but in Copenhagen in 2009, the industrialized countries agreed to transfer substantial new resources to the developing world to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. In fact, they agreed to supply $100 billion a year in new and additional financing to the global south. And they also started down the path of establishing a new institution, the Green Climate Fund, to take a lot of these resources and to basically become the mechanism to transfer them from north to south. Well, the Green Climate Fund just opened for business in South Korea, outside of Seoul. There is a small problem, however, which is that it doesn't have any money. It sort of takes the fund out of takes the fun out of fund. So presumably every country in Latin America and the Caribbean has an interest in generating more north-south financing, especially to address adaptation. And adaptation funding in particular is undersupplied right now by existing flows of resources. Only about, well, depending on how you measure it, only about 5% or so of flows from north to south address adaptation. Given that this is presumably a major concern for Latin American countries, I guess my question is, does the region have a common position on climate finance that cuts across the different negotiating blocs? Related to this, to what extent are they willing to accept conditions, including monitoring and evaluation schemes, in order to generate more aid and loans from donor countries? This is a big divide right now between donor countries and recipient countries in the developing world, which is that a lot of donor countries say, well, if we're going to give you new aid or loans to address climate change, we want to be able to track their effectiveness, and that's going to have to be part of the development of the loan and the program and the implementation of the project, et cetera. So again, to me, this is another area where I'm curious, at least, as to whether the Latin American countries have a common position and sort of where they stand on some of these issues related to climate finance. And I think my impression at least is that this issue of North-South finance is basically the linchpin right now, the sort of political linchpin of the global climate regime. So developing countries are reluctant to participate in the climate regime in any meaningful way without substantial new resources from the North to help them mitigate and adapt. So where Latin American countries stand on this question could have an important impact on future negotiations, especially given that the next big meeting is going to be hosted in Peru. I'll end on that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you're going to be able to see everybody, or
Yeah,
do we
fine.
need to pull this out a little bit?
I'll figure it out.
Can you sit down? Okay. There. All right. So we will open it to discussion now.
So you talk about a Latin American model of development with low emissions, maybe it's in. But how transferable is this model? How much dependent on geography, in fact, is this model? I'm thinking that hydropower and biofuels are important components of the model. Biofuels to a large degree, especially insulation, that they just have more energy from the sun, and this portion of the world can be exported to high latitudes. Same thing goes for hydropower. Hydrological cycle there for insulation plus atmospheric flow provides us with a lot of water flowing down. So is this really a model that can be exported? And from the point of view of hydropower, are we not sort of running out already? So I didn't go into the details of what this model actually is, but can we really look to this region of the world for inspiration on how to go on a low carbon emission scenario, or is just something that works there, but because of latitude, it's just to a large degree?
Great. How are we doing this? We're going to take a couple, or should we just?
I think it would be easier one by one,
That's fine with me.
and then whoever wants to answer each specific question.
So if anybody was there yesterday, you'll probably guess what I'm going to answer today, and that is there's indeed advantages that many Latin American countries have with nice mountains that get a lot of rain on them. However, that's not well taken advantage of in other places, and I think some of the countries that had no oil had a lot of incentive to take advantage of that, and other places could do so as well. However, there's been a lot of objection among environmentalists to big hydro, anything over 1 megawatt. So there's new models, sort of more run-of-the-river hydro facilities where they actually put turbines under the bottom of the river bed, so they're not having to create a big dam and flood, ecosystems and take away farmers' land and have to resettle people and so on. So I think there is a new generation of hydro, both for Latin America and for other parts of the world. Yes, the sun shines nicely on the tropics, and it's a big asset. But I mentioned yesterday that the biggest solar energy producer in the world is Germany, in spite of its cold weather and cloudy skies, sort of like Ohio. Where I live in Rhode Island isn't any different, so I'm not pointing any fingers. I grew up here. So anyway, that there's still, with the right government incentives and enough technological advancement, that a lot of renewables could replace a lot of what we're doing. And then there's just efficiency. Really, that's a lot. For example, in Brazil has been on, and most of Latin America has been on, nobody talks about these, but the propane tanks for people's stoves. So the truck goes around the neighborhood, right, and people bring their, empty propane tank like you do for your barbecue, right? We drive to the hardware store, but in Latin America, the truck comes to your neighborhood and you trade this thing in and you get a new one. Those are highly efficient and much cleaner, for urban air pollution, but also it means we don't have to use charcoal and other wood. So anyway, there's a lot of, and there's pretty high levels of efficiency in the appliances in the region and so on. So there are things that I think are not weather related, and there's a whole school of thought on environment that efficiency gains could be by a factor of 4 or a factor of 10 in the way we design our spaces, our buildings, and our appliances here in the wealthy wealthy northern nations. So really, if we're going to make a shift to renewables, we have to also make a huge shift in efficiency to make them work. But I think we could learn from those pathways in Latin America. But you point to some important things that are different. Ethanol, in the United States means corn, right, and soybean oils. And that's just not a good deal for anybody except for the farmers, getting sort of a subsidy. But it's, raising the price of food, it's, messing with food systems. It's not very efficient in terms of amount of petroleum that has to go into its production, as opposed to, like sort of a sugar-based ethanol like in Brazil, or cellulosic, anyway, we could go on about this stuff. So there's a lot to that I think if the U.S. would get to a better ethanol system, we could get some gains from that. But Right.
and sort of maybe indirect pressure there might be on Latin American countries to not upset China too much in the negotiations. But if China becomes a greater source of foreign aid, right, with a different aid model, then I could see that might be appealing to Latin American countries to turn to China more for climate finance than the industrialized countries of the North, who are, there's a trend with foreign aid of sort of OECD countries to attach, to focus much more attention on effectiveness and being able to track performance and whether this aid is effective or not. So there's sort of the China angle to that question. And I just want to quickly say, and your question made me think about this too, there's a difference between countries that have low emissions for circumstantial reasons and countries that have low emissions or declining emissions because of policy changes, and sometimes costly policy changes.
Yeah.
And to me, there's a crucial distinction. If Latin America has low emissions today mostly because of circumstantial reasons, right, then it doesn't necessarily tell us that much about A, what other countries should be doing, which is your point, or B, what the future holds for that region if they start to face trade-offs. So that's one way to think about it, is if you have low emissions because you're not facing trade-offs, and that was, I guess, my point about these, the sort of fossil fuel boom. Oh, now there's a trade-off, cheap economic growth or cheap energy versus low emissions. And I'm not sure we can infer from existing levels of emissions that are a matter of circumstances or convenience when it comes to what the choices will be. My impression is there isn't a proven track record of implementing costly climate change policies in order to keep emissions low. So that's, I thought about that in the context of your question as well.
So, Kathy, do you want me to respond or no? I can wait. Why don't I wait? Let's get some other voices in the room. Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit with Venezuela. My experience with Ecuador, it's obviously in the same position where there are significant internal inconsistencies with their role in the international bloc's negotiation. Ecuador is, on the one hand, involved with ALBA, and he takes a very strong Pachamama stance. On the other hand, they are an OPEC nation, and they are working to develop their petroleum resources. The cynic might say that some of their Pachamama emphasis is populist in nature. How do these inconsistencies work within countries within the region, as far as finding a common voice?
So, Pachamama is sort of the Mother Earth, right? The view that Mother Earth is our mother, and well, I can't really explain it. It's just, can you explain it a little more?
Just the idea that the ethic of Mother Earth having the same rights, ecology having an equal right, I suppose. Yeah. And certainly there have been efforts with the Ecuadorian Constitution, for example, to codify the fact that Mother Nature has certain rights as well, and everyone has access to those benefits.
Yeah. So my co-author, Guy Edwards, has just been living in Ecuador for about 4 or 5 years, and just is up from there, and so we pay a lot of attention to Ecuador. It's a fascinating case, including this, the effort they had to set aside part of its oil reserves and said to the rest of the world, if you pay us, we'll keep it in the ground, and if you don't, then we'll have to, extract it and burn it. And the rest of the world did not come up with the money. So they're now extracting it and or opening it up, and they'll start, burning it. So I think it shows in some way that how deep is the real dedication to Pachamama when there is the tough decisions are being made about whether to extract and burn fossil fuels. The Pachamama discourse is fascinating. I guess I would say I need to understand more about it. That is, it is kind of brought out as a populist um, expression, of connection to the indigenous history of the countries, and this is true also in Bolivia as well. But then these are also countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. So I guess to me they both exist. I mean, we have maybe equivalently contradictory discourses in our own country that exist at the same time. So I don't see how they have to necessarily be resolved, but they do show that maybe political leaders are using one or another at a different time, or but it does seem that in the bottom the fossil fuel dependency is there and it's increasing, and it makes it difficult
to answer that too.
Great.
No, not really to answer, but
I'm really open to Latin Americanists and Latin Americans' input on this.
I'm not prepared. I mean, I'm not qualified to answer that. But just to add something to the conversation, because this is a very interesting a topic in which I have something I can say. I mean, the summa causae and the notion or the idea of the summa causae. I mean, the good living, and the Pachamama as a subject of rights, we can say human rights. I mean, is a complex and philosophical issue that, but I'm very interested indeed. But perhaps Fernando can say something more about that. But one of the issues I think is one of the problems is to think not only all Latin America as a whole unit, but each country as an homogeneous voice. I mean, it's like in this country. I mean, you have so many different positions, and understandings and interests that are playing and complicated the field. So I agree. I mean, yes, we can see both in Bolivia and Ecuador, the countries which, I mean, they are embedded in their constitutions.
Right.
I mean, these principles are embedded. I mean, I think at the beginning of the Constitution. But that doesn't mean that the governments are really applying or complying with those ideals.
Right.
And this is actually in those countries. In Ecuador and Bolivia, there is a strong political debate about this issue. Not from a green position, because I agree with you, I don't think in Latin America there is a green position. But I mean, green issues, issues related to the world, the global warming. Global warming, as you said, I mean, is absolutely undenied in Latin America. Everybody believes that it's happening, and if you go and talk to people in the street, they will say, yeah, this is an example of global warming. You know, I mean, everybody is very convinced about that. The issue is, again, the issue of development. I mean, it's again the tough issue. And not only governments, not only just political parties, not only, I mean, even if you ask people, what is your first choice, you know, I mean, people will have, most of the people will have a tough moment, a tough time, I mean, to decide, because I mean that's a crucial, it's a crucial problem that is I mean, it has to do with the living. I don't know. Just
that's very useful.
I don't know.
I would say it shows that often when there's these constitutional assemblies, you know, the writing of a new constitution, that there's ability of environmental groups and indigenous groups to influence the process in a different way at those moments than there is maybe in the annual budgeting and, you know, decision making about, you know, where government revenue is going to come from and where, you know, where the spending is going to happen and which investments to allow, and the power of, you know, foreign oil producers or national construction companies, you know, ability to have an impact on decision-making inside of ministries is very different than those sort of constitutional moments. So that might explain some of the difference between the, as you said, the legal basis that they have to take care of this and when they actually do. But on those survey questions, there are, Latin Americans in general have been much more willing to say that protecting the environment is more important than the economy. Much higher levels than the United States, for example. So I think there is a greater willingness to give up, at least say they would give up some economic growth for protecting the environment.
Well, and I think the discourse now compared to 10 years ago or 20 years ago is significantly different. I'm sort of generalizing now, but whereas 20 years ago, most developing countries would have said, you know, we're not going to devote a single cent or policy change to climate change because that's a problem that the global north created, right? And they should pay for it because they have more capacity. They're more historically responsible. Whereas I think now the discourse has changed a little bit, which is, yes, we do have some responsibility, though we'd like you to meet us halfway, you meaning the global north, right? And this is why the issue of financing has become so important. So what I could imagine is, you know, some willingness to forego some economic growth if, you know, if the donor countries could meet the recipient countries, you know, 80% of the way or something like that. Would obviously vary across countries. But I could see that more now than I could have imagined even just five years ago, you know.
Alex, I know you have a meeting, so when you need to get up and leave, that's fine. I saw two hands that were up. Yours, you were up first, and you were the second person? Okay.
If I leave abruptly, it's because I have time for meetings.
I come from China, city like Columbus, geography. 10 years ago, there is no industry and not mining automobile in the city. And in winter, there are always some big snow like Columbus now. But these 10 years, the city become bigger and bigger, and there are mining industry and automobile. Recent years, there is no snow in winter. Because we see this is industry leads to warm house and leads to climate change. 10 years ago, there are no industry in that city, and there is always big snow like Columbus in city, but now there is no snow in winter. Because we see this is industry leads to climate change.
Well, there is local warming, but probably it's, at a time when there's just been global changes in seasonality, seasons.
Mm-hmm.
You had some pretty remarkable numbers about Brazil when you're talking about Lula in terms of reducing emissions and deforestation rates in a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering if you could speak to how they were able to accomplish that in such a short amount of time.
Yep. So they changed the forest code in Brazil. They first made it more difficult that you had to protect more of your land from deforestation. And then there was good enforcement with satellite, real-time satellite images being used by enforcement agents that would get right out on the ground and go and seize equipment and so on. And you had to have a plan that was approved if you were going to do any clearing. So this was also, Marina Silva was the environment minister, and she was really strong. And then Carlos Mink came after her, and he was very strong. And they did have some external support for the satellite tracking, and also the Brazilian Space Agency and so on. So it was a case of, they wanted to address the issue. There was political will, and there was technology, and there was enforcement. And so the state and the corruption in the Amazon somehow was not too bad, not so bad as to overwhelm all three of those, which it had in the past. And then I had another point. I've lost it now.
Why is it worse now?
Why is it getting worse? Okay, thank you. Soybean prices. So soybean, the soy frontier is booming in the southern part of the Amazon. And there was another interesting thing that happened, that there was big pressure by Greenpeace on some of the soybean producers in the region. And they exerted that pressure by pressuring McDonald's and other international brands to not buy chicken that had been fed the soybeans from the Amazon. So there was the group of soybean producers who are huge agribusinesses, huge, and very mechanized and using genetically modified crops and so on, very, using satellite positioning, adjusting what they're putting on the soil based on, this micro information that they get from soil testing, and anyway, very scientific. They're even double and triple cropping during each annual year, so each year they're producing 2 or 3 crops of soy per year. And they made up, because of this political pressure, which was also on Cargill and other, soybean exporting groups, they had a moratorium on any new clearing of rainforest for soybean production. So that moratorium is just run out, and I think that's since then that there's been a new jump in the deforestation rate. And a new forest code got passed in the Congress. There's this bancada ruralista, the rural block of voters in the Congress, especially in the Senate, because each state in Brazil has 3 senators. So the problem that we have in the U.S. of unbalanced representation and high representation of the farm states is even worse in Brazil, that they're able to resist a lot of progressive legislation, and they're able to, in this case, push through reforms that look like they're going to be driving this deforestation in the wrong direction. And then there's the change in the presidency, that Dilma is just not as environmental as Lula was. Her environment ministry is much weaker. The woman she has in charge is not the same kind of environmentalist as Marina Silva or Carlos Mink.
Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, there's one.
My question is mainly about the negotiation process in the UN.
Yeah.
It was part of your talk. And I wonder if you took into account the role of the private sector and the investment of the private sector. You did mention a little bit about how China also have private investment coming into Latin America. And I'm from Panama, and I know how much influence we have for private investment there. And I know how that ties with whatever decision the government takes. And I know that happens also at the macro level all throughout the whole region. And I was wondering if you have, also look at and how that might play a big role in the negotiation process for any new agreement.
Well, I'd love to hear any any stories. Maybe we'll get to talk afterwards. That'd be great. One interesting bit is that Alex asked about was China and investments versus aid, and it's interesting because it's different in Central America. China has done more aid, and this is kind of funny. That is, there was more investment in the natural resources in South America, and there's more grants on the side of aid in Central America. So why is that? It turns out that some of the few countries in the world that have supported Taiwan getting recognized as a country by the United Nations are in Central America. And so Taiwan was always giving aid to these Central American countries until the last maybe 5 years, when mainland China has, effectively given projects. There's stories of soccer stadiums and presidential palaces in the Caribbean and stuff, and it's really swung some of the allegiance. And some countries no longer recognize Taiwan in the UN, so it's been effective use of aid in terms of China's national interests in the UN. And that's, you know, this is not, China is not alone in doing this kind of thing. There's stories of, you know, Japan paying countries, or giving a lot of foreign aid to countries so that they'll vote with them in the International Whaling Commission. Or, you know, the U.S., of course, is famous. After Copenhagen in the WikiLeaks, there was information about our giving aid and threatening to withdraw aid from Ecuador and Peru if they did not support the Copenhagen Accord and so on. So aid is often used this way, but I think in China's case it is somewhat different. So I don't really know much about the Panama case. I'd love to hear more.
I'd like to add something about China. In the case of Venezuela, in exchange for, and I don't know if it was a loan with a really nice interest rate or if it was an outright grant, but Venezuela guaranteed China for the next 50 years petroleum
Right.
at today's prices.
Yeah, no, that was also to get pipelines built, some extractive facilities for these tar sands, right, and the Orinoco fields.
Oh,
And,
Orinoco fields, yay.
So it's, yeah, there's been,
Not good.
this agreement is really worrisome. That Venezuela is
Venezuelans in general
really
don't
losing
like
control.
it.
Yeah, and
They do not
they've
like
agreed to produce and sell a certain quantity over these years. It's a lot of oil. So it's locked Venezuela into a development pathway for a long time to come.
Yep. Do we have any other questions or comments? Well, then join me in thanking Timmons.
Thank you all.
And I already